Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's December 10, 2021, and today we're speaking about the media in Myanmar with Lisa Brooten, Associate Professor in the College of the Arts and Media at Southern Illinois University Carbondale, who has been working on Myanmar and media-related matters for over 20 years. Hello, Lisa.
Hi, it's good to see you, Luke.
Very good to see you too, and thank you for recording in this late hour in another time zone. So, the Myanmar Musings podcast has run an annual episode on press freedom every year since 2017, but we've never had a guest on to discuss, all the other facets of journalism in Myanmar and the long view. So, let's try and historicise things briefly before we get into talking about, of course, the coup. Lisa, you co-edited an impressive tome, Myanmar Media in Transition, Legacies, Challenges and Change, which was put together, I think, in the early years of the National League for Democracy administration that ended in February. So I want to ask you this big opening up question. What was the transition? What were the challenges, and what changed or was changing in, say, the 10 years leading up to 2021? Or if you like, you can begin with 1988.
So I'll just try to sort of sum that up in a few minutes. Since you mentioned 1988, that was really, I think, the beginning of, I would maybe say, the contemporary era of journalism in Myanmar. Prior to that, there had been more of a focus, I think, on writers and writing that had been kind of more seen with a little more respect historically in Myanmar. So 1988, many of the students who fled and some of their allies established exile media. Of course, there also was a small and, throughout the decades, growing segment of media internal to the country. And when I say media here, I mean journalism and journalists and writers who were trying to kind of break the stranglehold on freedom of expression. So we had what we called the independent media in exile, sort of developing alongside whatever struggling kind of forward movement could be made internally in the country. And those, of course, involved different kinds of strategies and different kinds of opportunities for those inside and outside, obviously. And then I think it's just important to understand that the exile media kind of developed along two lines. One, I would say, was kind of an unmarked, sort of ethnically unmarked, sort of more mainstream independent exile media. So we're talking here about the Irrawaddy, Democratic Voice of Burma, Myanmar, groups like that. And then we also had the more ethnically focused, what have been called for a long time ethnic media. That were more local in focus, generally targeted in the ethnic languages to ethnic communities. But then later we saw those groups also develop and branch out and start realizing that they needed to kind of do outreach as well beyond their communities, and so reaching across the borders. We also saw this among the mainstream independent media, the development of at least some work in the Thai language, not with DVB, Myanmar, Irrawaddy, but the other groups also were publishing in Thai and other languages as well. So Thai and Burmese, of course, and then in English. So all of those media, the exile media and the media inside as well, they had much less space to develop, but the exile media really increased in number and sophistication over the years, so that by the time the changes started to happen, the media landscape was kind of like you had the state stranglehold over the daily newspaper sector and the broadcast sector. The very small sort of sector of private, they were journals and bi-weekly magazines that were able to publish prior to the opening, starting with things that were rather apolitical, like sports journals and fashion and that kind of thing, and then kind of eventually building into more substantive areas over time. Again, the folks inside pushing the envelope while the folks outside are kind of grappling with other sorts of things like training around, well, even the people inside were doing training as well, although not to the same extent. Anyway, so that was kind of the situation prior to the opening. And then the opening itself, obviously a lot of things changed. Pre-publication censorship was lifted in 2012. 2013 was the liberalization of the daily newspaper sector, which expanded very rapidly to like more than 30, and then kind of whittled down because of the, inability, obviously, of the market to hold that many daily papers. There were legal reforms that opened space for freedom of expression, but also many laws that remained problematic, as we know, right? During the transition, there was an attempt really to try to break the state's monopoly control over broadcasting. This is where a lot of the foreign funding went in the media sector. There was a real push to make the state broadcaster, MRTV, into a public service broadcaster. So spectacularly large amounts of money went into that project, unfortunately. Unfortunately now is kind of no longer functioning as a project. But there was some opening in the broadcasting sector when we saw the 5 private broadcast licenses, and then, but really that's kind of where we were. A huge influx of donor money. A lot of it really, I think, in hindsight, and even at the time, it was being a lot of the large donors who kind of rushed in with lots of money, kind of trying to make inroads with the state, really centered the state in the development efforts. And now we can look back with hindsight and see that as a very problematic approach. So that's kind of where we were prior to the coup.
I haven't heard about what was going on there with attempts to transform MRTV. That seems to have had little success even during, the years that I was living in Myanmar. I never saw any difference really in MRTV. I mean, yeah, could you talk more about that? That's really interesting. Who was trying to do that? Because it's actually quite an innovative and incredible thing for a nation state to have a really dedicated public service broadcaster with integrity. I think it's actually rare in the whole world and a very noble endeavor. Could you talk a little bit more about where that came from and what the outcome was and what?
Yeah, well, I think one really important factor in that focus was the Democratic Voice of Burma, which of course was based in Oslo, Norway, right? And the Norwegians were also very interested in the peace process. So their interest in media kind of aligned with that as well, with their interest in connecting and being part of the peace process and connecting with the government in that way, both the government and the military, and all the ways that those two intersected, right? So I think it was part of a larger strategy on the part of Norway, for example. So there were trips by major, Ministry of Information and other major officials prior to the opening to explore how public broadcasting works in Europe, right? So European tour and everything. And some of us trying to kind of also make note of the fact that that Thailand right next door had recently established a public service broadcaster with a rather different model than the European model. Anyway, there were discussions going on about this and prior to the opening happening. And then I think it was just, for many individual people, it was a genuine effort to really try to, do that, to make this. But, those two, when we talk about Europe and the environment there, I mean, the European environment is where public service broadcast, it's the home of public service broadcasting as a concept, right? I mean, the US never really had as robust. We started really with a commercial system, and very differently than the way Europe, the formation of public service in the United States, North America, and in Europe is very different, right? And then completely different from sort of the much later, rather kind of external idea of public broadcasting that was then sort of brought to places like Thailand and Myanmar, right? Which, it's a very interesting, it's an experiment, and we could talk for a whole show about Thailand and the Thai PBS, but I know that's not your focus here, but the idea there was to do that. And I think one of the things that, from what I understand, and I have to say I haven't studied this extensively, but from what I understand, JICA was very important in that process, but also the European Union and others were very important in the process of kind of also this idea of training the previous military officials and the idea of what a public service broadcaster is about, right? And from what I understand, there was a whole generation of, in many cases, also ethnic young journalists who were brought in because they also tried to do kind of shows in ethnic languages and cater to or at least catering to the ethnic communities that are, all across the country, obviously, right? And from what I understand, some of those folks who were trained, the young people, there was basically a schism, as I understand, culturally within the institution between the older folks who really were having trouble grasping the concept and being interested in wanting to change much of anything. And then the young people who were gung-ho, wanted to be journalists and were very excited. But from what I understand, a lot of those young people actually joined the CDM at the start of right after the coup. So that's kind of what I do know. It's easy to look back now and kind of criticize, but I think even at the time, there was a lot of criticism of the way that was done. Well, first of all, without much consultation at all among existing stakeholders, existing local media outlets, and existing donors who had been working with them for decades. So there was kind of, in that beginning of that opening period, a kind of rush in of kind of new donor money in the media development area, kind of along with the kind of more quiet, under the radar work of a lot of several donors who had been there for a while. And that kind of was tense, which I will say, Luke, is very interesting now because Chiang Mai has once again become kind of a hub for some of these groups. And there's a kind of a very different sort of pecking order now. I mean, like the groups who had experience in exile and have networks, the ethnic minority media that are already long time based on the border, have the kind of stability needed to help set up the new people who are running out, or to kind of at least have networks existent that they can go back to, in the case of those that were in exile previously. So, those who have no experience in exile are now learning this whole new area, this whole new landscape. And it's very interesting. This is a very interesting period of retrospection and reflection on the kind of move, during the opening to the kind of, many of the donors moved inside the country very rapidly. And that was very controversial.
Yeah, well, we've talked a lot now about using these categories, right? If we're thinking about media organizations in Myanmar, and it's been kind of a common way of describing media organizations in Myanmar to use these categories of an exile organization, as you've said, a local organization, an ethnic media organization, and then, say, international or English language organizations. But there's been a lot of shuffling that you're getting at since February, and some of these walls are kind of blurring. So would you still use those categories? Are they still the best way to think about what's going on in Myanmar? I mean, if you go on Facebook, you'll see all these, new news organizations, but they're not accredited, or they're not... they don't have the coveted blue dot that they're all trying to get on Facebook. That means that they are real, quote unquote. So yeah, you've talked about this pecking order and the reshuffling that's going on. Should we be starting to conceptualize or think about the media organization landscape differently for Myanmar?
I think we're going to have to. I mean, I think whether we want to or think it's a good idea or not. I mean, it's changing. I mean, any media groups that are doing any kind of independent work are really at this point out of the country. I mean, they may have their journalists inside, they may have their citizen journalists that are working, everyone's in hiding and so on. So right away, there's a reshuffling here. There's a kind of there's a total, I don't even know what to call it, upheaval of the media landscape. I mean, it's, many, many journals have shut down or been shut down, right? They just can't function right now. And we're totally rejigging how they're doing things, right? I mean, but I also think because there's such an interesting discourse around federalism, that we need to also be thinking about this concept in the area of communication policy, right? We really need to be thinking. I mean, one of the things that has become very, very clear during both COVID and the coup is the importance of the ethnic media organizations. Those have been developed, but basically those organizations were put under very severe threat of dissolution when the funders went back inside the country. I mean, there really was, and this is another way in which some of the large funders who were working very much from a kind of a urban-centric, Yangon-centric perspective, state-centric perspective, did not really recognize the development that had been happening over decades in these organizations and the importance that they have, especially in a country, multi-ethnic country like Myanmar, especially in an era when they were trying to create, a peace process and so on. But yeah, the importance of the ethnic media during COVID, especially in areas that were far flung, to kind of both get information to local populations, right? But also from local populations to the central, planning around COVID was very, very vital. And groups like Progressive Voice and other civil society organizations are pretty open about that, the importance of the ethnic media even prior to the coup. And then after the coup, with the increased importance of the EAOs, the ethnic armed organizations, right, with the increased importance of the lens that we need across the entire country to understand kind of really what's going on, right? The ethnic media have taken on huge importance, let alone, and that's not even talking about the logistical support that they offer to the media that were fleeing either into exile or into some safe area, right? So all of those things have kind of catapulted the ethnic media into kind of more of a centralized position in the donor viewpoint, from the donor viewpoint, I hope. Yeah. So I think that that's a really important change. And I think, I do think if we're thinking more about a federal system, a federal army, a federal, figuring out how to organize the country along different lines, I think media needs to be centrally part of that planning.
One thing I notice when I'm reading all of these various sources for work or just for interest is the huge difference in either formal or informal editorial policies between these news organizations in Myanmar. So whether it's Shripimi Media, Shan News, something like that, what they choose to focus on and how they write about what happens, compared to these new youth organizations in Yangon who call the military dogs and will write about 10 protests in cities every day, but they never mention what happens in, Shan State. There's this diversity. And I've been thinking about this cleavage, especially about the way that organizations talk about the revolution, what's happening right now. There's a lot of organizations that seem to be nailing their flag to the mast or whatever, that they are an underground revolutionary news organization first and foremost, rather than an, independent, fact verifying, Have you noticed anything like that? Do you agree with me there? What do you think is going to be the consequence of this kind of, is it a schism or is it simply just a spectrum and all of these media organizations are kind of on the same page deep down?
That's a good question. Well, I don't think we can discount the decades between 80. I mean, basically what we're talking about here is a replay of the same discourse that was coming out in 1988. When I was on the border in 1989, meeting a lot of the students that set up those exile media organizations, they were talking in that same kind of language, right? The ABSDF had a propaganda department, the All Burma Students Democratic Front. And Manipulaw was the ethnic headquarters and so on. I mean, there was not the same conception of this. There wasn't this conception of independent journalism you're talking about in that question, right? And that's kind of what I was meaning by, while the internal media that were under severe censorship were kind of pushing the envelope as best they could, the external media were getting, I don't even know how, decades of trainings, decades of opportunity to meet with state level officials from countries all around the world, opportunities to lobby or at least, represent what was going on. There was a huge amount of professional development during those decades. So I think the second sort of suggestion you made that this is more like a continuum, I think, probably we could say that even the more established media themselves, have kind of crossed in some cases to language that might not be considered professional. I still think that there's a significant amount of development. And also I think it's a legitimate question and a debate, of course. First of all, does this idea of objective journalism actually exist? Of course not. It's normative, right? It's something that's to be aspired toward, right? On the other hand, it's one thing to judge journalism written by a parachute journalist who parachutes into a community they're not connected to than it is to talk about a journalist who lives in the communities that are being attacked. And those kinds of questions are often not, it's as though all these journalists should behave in the same way, right? And I think that that's very unrealistic. So I do think it's a continuum. I think, on the other hand, I think that the credibility of really good independent journalism is proving to be extremely important and valued at these moments. So, I think that those, and I think in some ways that sort of like a revolutionary language is a function of youth also. I mean, in some ways, right? Like we need that voice too, right? Like that's the fire under all of us, right? So
there's some really good points there. And it makes me think of the next question, leads on very well, which is, what's a journalist? So in post-coup Myanmar, citizen journalists, everyone's talking about citizen journalists. They've again become crucial. They have to information reporting and access. People who would never consider themselves citizen journalists have become citizen journalists. Technology has moved on so much since the last time that citizen journalists were so important in Myanmar. So I guess I want to ask about that, the technological side first. Like, how is information being disseminated, shared, verified now in the age of the smartphone? And are these formal media organizations still as important as they were when they can't really function without these young risk-taking people who may they don't get a salary, they just film things when they can, photograph things when they can, report when they can?
Yeah, good question. I mean, obviously journalism is changing in the age of social media and citizen journal. I mean, talking about from a broad global perspective, right? So, we're in the midst of that. It really remains to be seen what journalism is going to look like. But in the Myanmar case, I would argue that those kind of mainstream journalist gatekeepers, the ones who have been identified as independent, I mean, more or less, everybody makes mistakes, right? Slips or whatever. You get a weird editorial here and there, right? Okay. But I really think that those outlets have become valued more than ever. in an age where misinformation is rampant, you need places where someone's going to shuffle through all that crap, right? And really dilute it to, now obviously that's not going to stop people from going down the rabbit hole of misinformation, but like, well, hopefully it will actually. I mean, if you've got some really dependable media outlets that people can still go to it, you know, people are. The coup, and I mean, it's not just the coup in Myanmar. I mean, this is just a known fact. When crisis erupts, people go to the media, right? It's like their go-to. They want to know what's happening. And often they're jumping channels all over the place, right? It's not like they go to one place. And this kind of also gets to your question about misinformation and journalism, in a sense, is I really think that, I mean, theoretically, this is the argument, right? If you want to understand the ways in which a system is problematic or corrupt, you look at it from the perspective of those who are most marginalized by that system, right? And if we look at sort of a global media system, and we look at sort of, you know, Facebook, I mean, Myanmar is the poster child for what Facebook did wrong. And I don't think you can go through that as a country and not come out more aware and stronger. This is the whole point, right? It is like those people in those positions who are most targeted are going to be the ones who have developed the best defenses, who understand the best what is actually happening. So if we want to understand what the biggest problems with Facebook are, we have to go to those people who, like the Rohingya and their allies, right? And, you know, there's a whole history of civil society, Myanmar civil society organization work with Facebook prior to the 2017 genocide. And, you know, that's the only reason why Facebook was responsive in 2017, was because they had already been working with civil society groups. So anyway, the whole point there is, you know, there's a long history here. Groups kind of build on the work of those coming before them. Yeah, I think, honestly, I think that this is a really exciting, as horrific as everything is in Myanmar and daily. I mean, the most recent denial on the global newslet of Myanmar, you know, is that the horrific torchings of human beings in Sagaing didn't happen. Right. I mean, people can see beyond this at this point. So, you know, part of being in that position of being, you know, among the most marginalized by that discourse, right, is that you figure out how to debunk it. Right. And I see that a lot of that on social media right now. I actually have a lot of hope about what's happening right now. I think that this is a moment where there's a confluence of events. In some ways, this looks a lot like 1988. And I hear people talking about, oh, we're back to, you know, especially the media, those folks who came out in 88 and then had to flee again this time, right? And they're just like, we're back to where we were, you know. But no, that's not where the country is, right? The country is decades ahead, and in large part because of what those folks built, right? And the things that those folks built. And I just think that there's a hopeful discourse of reflection, of intersectionality, of multi-ethnicity, you know, a recognition of the need to listen to each other. I have never seen that. I've never seen that to this extent in really 30 years of being intimately very close and interested in Myanmar and watching the country and, you know, getting to know its people. And, you know, so I'm actually really hopeful despite all the stuff we hear coming out daily. I think Myanmar is in a place to make a real difference in the region once they can oust this military.
And so that effort to oust the SAC, the Tatmadaw, from their position in Myanmar, as we know, is being waged in many fronts: armed resistance, peaceful protest, but there's also, information warfare going on, and that doesn't mean that the information is a weapon or necessarily a problem. But how do you see the media being important to this very widely held, shared mission to change Myanmar into a place with a different governance structure?
Yeah, I mean, efforts to democratize the country, right? Or keep control over it. I mean, look, so here's the thing. I want to be very careful because media themselves are tools, right? And I think we have to be really careful, right? Like, this is not like a Facebook revolution or, a Twitter revolution, right? This is a Burmese revolution that happens to have the tools of Facebook and Twitter that change the landscape significantly, of course, right? But I do think the nature of the tools that we have and the fact that they've changed so much and the fact that we are now digitally interconnected, even despite efforts to shut down the internet, to significantly control it, right? The nature of the technology itself makes that virtually impossible, right? It's a network. It's not a broadcasting node that you can take out, it doesn't really work that way, thank God, But just like we have tools to kind of fight against the autocrats, they are, of course, are using the tools, as we know, as well. So the battle has moved online in many ways, right? So there's now this hybrid online-offline component, and how they work together is pretty fascinating. So we obviously, propaganda's age-old, but this idea of crowdsourcing documentation of substantial human rights abuses and the ability to do that on the scale that we have is new, as is the amount and the level and the degree of surveillance that we also are subjected to, right? So again, it's like the landscape has shifted. The players remain the same, I guess, is there. But yes, definitely, the networking nature of the new technologies is huge. That structural change in the way that technologies function is huge.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for all of this, sharing your insight on your expertise and your history of working and studying the media in Myanmar. It's been really great. The last question, to put you on the spot, is to ask you for a recommendation. It can be anything to do with Myanmar. It doesn't need to be research. Since we're talking about the media, you might want to go in that direction. Do you have anything to recommend to our listeners at this important and dynamic time in Myanmar's 21st century history?
I think probably the one most important thing, just in terms of thinking about media, it would make sense to really start thinking about the media system in the country as a whole. And if the country is being revisioned as a federal democracy, then to really think in terms of the structure of a federal democracy, in terms of how media might be structured and regulated. So that is on the kind of policy level. And policy donor kind of foreigner recommendation for donor level. On the personal level, I would just really I just really want to say that I admire the Burmese so much, and really the tenacity with which they are resisting this coup, and including the media and all the brave citizen journalists and journalists who are out there still providing us daily information on what's happening in the country. I have a lot of hope. I have a lot of faith in the long term in what's going on. And I think Myanmar will be a leader in really challenging the authoritarianism that we see globally right now, really, and regionally in Southeast Asia.
And hopefully sooner rather than later.
Yes.
Thank you very much for coming on Myanmar Musings, Lisa.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.